Now, I hope you can hear. I was told that the local paper has announced that I lecture tonight on the problem of Socrates. This was an intelligent printing error, for there is more than one problem of Socrates. In the first place, that problem with which Socrates was concerned. But one could say the problem with which Socrates was concerned may be of no concern to us, that it may not be relevant to us. Therefore, after all, there are so many things which concern us so much more obviously and urgently than the problem with which Socrates was concerned. But we receive an answer why we should be concerned with Socrates' problem by listening to the man from whom I took the title of this lecture, and which, as far as I remember, was coined by him. The problem of Socrates is the first immediately revealing title of a section in Nietzsche's Dawn of Idols, one of his last publications. Socrates and Plato, we hear, were décadents. More precisely, Socrates was a décadent who belonged to the lowest stratum of the common people, to the riffraff. I quote, "Everything is exaggerated, buffo, caricature in him. Everything is at the same time concealed, rich in afterthoughts, subterraneous," unquote. The enigma of Socrates is the idiotic equation of reason, virtue, and happiness, an equation opposed to all instincts of the earlier Greeks, of the Greek health and nobility. The key is supplied by Socrates' discovery of dialectics, that is to say, the quest for reason. The earlier high-class Greeks disdain to seek for and to present the reasons of their conduct, to abide by authority, by the command either of the gods or of themselves, was for them simply a matter of good manners. Only those people have recourse to dialectics who have no other means for getting listened to and respected. It is a kind of revenge which the low-born take of the high-born. Quote, the dialectician leaves it to his adversary to prove that he is not an idiot. He enrages, and at the same time makes helpless, unquote. Socrates fascinated because he discovered in dialectics a new form of agon, of contest. He thus won over the noble youth of Athens, and among them, above all, Plato. In an age when the instincts had lost their ancient surety and were disintegrating, one needed a non-instinctual tyrant. This tyrant is reason. Yet the cure belongs as much to decadence as the illness. When speaking of the earlier Greeks, Nietzsche thinks also of the philosophers, pre-Socratics, especially Heraclitus. This does not mean that he agreed with Heraclitus. One reason why he did not was that he, like all philosophers, lacked the so-called historical sense. Nietzsche's cure for all Platonism, and hence Socrates, was at all times Thucydides, who had the courage to face reality without delusion and to seek reason in reality and not in ideas. In Thucydides, the sophistic culture, that's to say the realistic culture, comes to its full expression. The section on the problem of Socrates in the Dawn of Idols is only a relic of Nietzsche's first publication, the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, which he disowned to some extent later on. One reason being that he had understood in that early work Greek tragedy in the light or the darkness of Wagnerian music. And he had come to see that Wagner was a décadent of the first order. In spite of this and other defects, Nietzsche's first work delineates his future life work with amazing clarity. I will therefore say something about that. Nietzsche faced Socrates as, quote, the single turning point and vortex of so-called world history, unquote. Nietzsche's concern was not merely theoretical. He was concerned with the future of Germany or the future of Europe, a human future that must surpass the highest that has ever been achieved before. The peak of man hitherto is that manner of life that found its expression in Greek tragedy, especially Aeschylean tragedy. The tragic understanding of the world was rejected and destroyed by Socrates, who therefore is, quote, the most questionable phenomenon of antiquity, unquote, a man of more than human size, a demigod. Socrates, in brief, is the first theoretical man, the incarnation of the spirit of science, radically unartistic and amusing. Quote, in the person of Socrates, the belief in the comprehensibility of nature and in the universal healing power of knowledge has first come to light, unquote. He is a prototype of the rationalist and therefore of the optimist. For optimism is not merely the belief that the world is the best possible world, but also the belief that the world can be made into the best of all imaginable worlds, or that the evil which belong to the best possible world can be rendered harmless by knowledge. Thinking cannot only fully understand being, but can even correct it. Life can be guided by science. The living gods of myth can be replaced by a deus ex machina. That's to say, the forces of nature as known and used in the service of, quote, higher egoism, unquote. Rationalism is optimism, This is the belief that reason's power is unlimited and essentially beneficent, or that science can solve all riddles and loosen all chains. Rationalism is optimism, since the belief in causes that depends on the belief in ends, or since rationalism presupposes the belief in the initial or final supremacy of the good. The full and ultimate consequences of the change effected or represented by Socrates appear only in the contemporary West, in the belief in universal enlightenment, and therewith in the earthly happiness of all within a universal society, in utilitarianism, liberalism, democracy, pacifism, and socialism. Both these consequences and the insight into the essential limitations of science have shaken, quote, Socratic culture, unquote, to its foundation. Quote, the time of Socratic man has gone, unquote. There is then hope for a future beyond the peak of pre-Socratic culture, for a philosophy of the future that is no longer merely theoretical, as all philosophy hitherto was, but knowingly based on acts on the will or on decisions. Nietzsche's attack on Socrates is an attack on reason. Reason, the celebrated liberator from all prejudices, proves itself to be based on a prejudice, and the most dangerous of all prejudices, the prejudice stemming from decadence. In other words, reason which waxes so easily and so highly indignant about the demanded sacrifice of the intellect rests itself on the sacrifice of the intellect. This criticism was made by a man who stood at the opposite pole of all obscurantism and fundamentalism. One would therefore misunderstand the utterances of Nietzsche on Socrates, which I quoted, or to which I referred, if one did not keep in mind the fact that Socrates exerted a lifelong fascination on Nietzsche. The most beautiful document of this fascination is a penultimate aphorism of Beyond Good and Evil, perhaps the most beautiful passage in Nietzsche's whole work. I do not dare attempt to translate it. Nietzsche does not mention Socrates there, but Socrates is there. Nietzsche says that the gods too philosophize, thus obviously contradicting Plato's banquet, according to which the gods do not philosophize, do not strive for wisdom, but are wise. In other words, the gods, as Nietzsche understands them, are not entia perfectissima, most perfect beings. To add only a few points, the serious opposition of Nietzsche to Socrates can also be expressed as follows. Nietzsche replaces error by the will to power, a striving which has a goal beyond striving, by a striving which has no such goal. In other words, philosophy as it was hitherto is likened to the moon, and philosophy of the future is like the sun. The former is contemplative and spends only borrowed light, is dependent on creative acts outside of it, preceding it. The latter is creative because it is animated by conscious will to power. Nietzsche and Zarathustra is a book for all and none, as it said on the title page. Socrates calls on some. I add one more point of no small importance. In the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, when taking issue with Plato and therewith with Socrates, Nietzsche says, as it were in passing, quote, Christianity is Platonism for the people. The profoundest interpreter, at the same time the profoundest critic of Nietzsche, is Heidegger. He is Nietzsche's profoundest critic precisely because he is his profoundest interpreter, precisely because he is his profoundest critic. The direction which his criticism takes may be indicated as follows. In the Zarathustra, Nietzsche had spoken of the spirit of revenge as animating all earlier philosophy. The spirit of revenge is, however, in the last analysis, concerned with revenge on time, and therewith it is an attempt to escape from time to eternity, to an eternal being. Yet Nietzsche also taught eternal return. For Heidegger, there is no longer eternity in any sense, or even sempiternity in any relevant sense. Despite of, or rather because of it, he preserved the condemnation or critique of Plato as the originator of what came to be modern science, and therewith modern technology. But through Heidegger's radical transformation of Nietzsche, Socrates almost completely disappeared. I remember only one statement of Heidegger on Socrates. He calls him the purest of all Western thinkers, while making it clear that purest is something very different from greatest. Is he insufficiently aware of the Odysseus in Socrates? Perhaps, but he surely sees a connection between Socrates' singular purity and the fact that he did not write. To come back to Heidegger's tacit denial of eternity, that denial implies that there is no way in which thought can transcend time, can transcend history. All thought belongs to, depends on something more fundamental, which thought cannot master. All thoughts belong radically to an epoch, a culture, a folk. This view is, of course, not peculiar to Heidegger. It emerged in the 19th century and today has become a truism for many people. But Heidegger has thought it through more radically than anyone else. Let us call this view historicism and define it as follows. Historicism is a view according to which all thought is based on absolute presuppositions, which vary from epoch to epoch, from culture to culture, which are not questioned and cannot be questioned in the situation to which they belong and which they constitute. This view is not refuted by the objectivity of science, by the fact that science transcends or breaks down all cultural barriers. For the science which does this is modern Western science, the child or stepchild of Greek science. Greek science was rendered possible by the Greek language, a particular language. The Greek language suggested those insights, divinations, or prejudices which made science possible. To give a simple example, science means knowledge of all being, anta to onta, a thought inexpressible in original Hebrew or Arabic. We have to pay some attention to this question of historicism, that's to say, of history in the first place. The anti-Socratic position, which I have tried to delineate, is not unproblematic. It would be unproblematic if we could take for granted the so-called historical consciousness, if the object of the historical consciousness, history with a capital H, had simply been discovered. But perhaps history is a problematic interpretation of phenomena which could be interpreted differently, which were interpreted differently in former times, and especially by Socrates and his descendants. I will illustrate that starting from a simple example. Xenophon, the pupil of Socrates, wrote a history called Hellenic, Greek history. This work begins abruptly with the expression thereafter. Thus, Xenophon cannot indicate what the intention of this work is. From the beginning of another work, one can infer that the Hellenica is devoted to the serious actions of gentlemen. Hence, the actions of those notorious non-gentlemen, the tyrants, do not, strictly speaking, belong in the history and are appropriately treated by Xenophon as excursuses, in excursuses. More important, this work also ends with the expression thereafter within the limits of the possible. What we call history is for Xenophon a sequence of thereafters, in each of which confusion, tare, rules. Socrates is also a gentleman, but a gentleman of a different kind. His gentlemanship consists in raising and answering the question, what is, regarding the various human things. But those what is are unchangeable and in no way in a state of confusion. As a consequence, Xenophon's Hellenica is only political history. The primacy of political history is still recognized. A historian still means a political historian unless we add an adjective like economic, art, and so on. Still, modern history is or is based upon philosophy of history. Philosophy of history begins with Vico. Yet Vico's new science, as he called it, is a doctrine of natural right. That's to say, a political doctrine. However this may be, modern history in the form in which we know it deals with all human activities and so on, with the whole of what is called culture. There is no culture in Greek thought, but there are, for instance, arts, techni, including the art of money-making and the imitative arts, and opinions, doxa, especially about the highest, the God. These opinions are therefore the highest, in which what we would call a culture. These opinions differ from nation to nation, and they may undergo changes within nations. They have the cognitive status of nomizomena, of things owing their being to being held, frozen results of abortive reasonings, which are declared to be sacred. They are, to borrow from a Platonic synonym, the feelings of caves. What we call history would be the succession or simultaneity of caves. These caves, the feelings are normal by convention, which is understood in contradistinction to physics by nature. In the modern century, there emerged a new kind of natural right doctrine, which is based on the devaluation of nature. Hobbes' state of nature is the best known example. Nature is here only a negative standard, that from which one should move away. On the basis of this, the law of reason, or the moral law, as it was called, ceased to be natural law. Nature is in no way a standard. This is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition of the historical consciousness. The historical consciousness itself may be characterized from the earlier point of view as follows. History, the object of the historical consciousness, is a sequence of nomoi, physics being understood as one nomos among many. Nomos has absorbed physics. Let me restate the issue in somewhat different terms as follows. The human species consists by nature of tribes or nations, ethnic. This is due partly directly to nature, different races, the size and structure of the surface of the earth, and partly to nomos, customs and languages. Every philosopher belongs essentially to this or that ethnos. But as a philosopher, he must transcend the prospect of a miraculous abolition or overcoming of the essential particularism for all men was held out in somewhat different ways by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A non-miraculous overcoming was visualized in modern times by means of the conquest of nature and the universal recognition of a purely rational nomos law, so that only the difference of languages remains, which even Stalin recognized as important. In reaction to this leveling, which seemed to deprive human life of its depth, philosophers began to prefer the particular, the local and temporal, to any universal instead of merely accepting the particular. To illustrate this by the best known example, they replaced the rights of man by the rights of Englishmen. According to historicism, every man belongs essentially and completely to a historical world. Hence, we cannot understand another historical world exactly as it understood or understands itself. We necessarily understand it differently than it understands itself. Understanding it better than it understood itself is, of course, altogether impossible and only been believed in by very simplistic anthropologists. Yet Heidegger characterizes all earlier philosophers, all earlier philosophic thought by oblivion of sign. I will explain that in a moment. Of the ground of grounds, which means in the decisive respect he claims to understand the earlier philosophers better than they understood themselves. This difficulty is not peculiar to Heidegger. It is essential to all forms of historicism. For historicism must assert that it is an insight surpassing all earlier insight, since it claims to bring to light the true character of all earlier insights. It put them in their place, if one may put it so crudely. At the same time, historicism asserts that insights are functions of time or period, times or periods. It suggests, therefore, implicitly that the absolute insight, the historicist insight, belongs to the absolute time, the absolute moment in history. But it must avoid even the semblance of raising such a claim for our time or for any time. For this would be tantamount to putting an end to history, to significant time. In other words, the historical process is not rational. Each epoch has its absolute presuppositions. In the formula of Ranke, all epochs are equally immediate to God. But historicism has brought to light this very fact, that's to say, the truly absolute presupposition. The historical insights remain true for all times. For if that insight were forgotten at some future time, this would merely mean a relapse into an oblivion in which man has always lived in the past. Historicism is an eternal verity. That, of course, is impossible. According to Heidegger, there are no eternal verities. Eternal verities would presuppose the eternity or sempiternity of the human race. Heidegger knows that the human race is not eternal or sempiternal. It's not this knowledge, the knowledge that the human race has had an origin, a cosmological insight. It is not the basis, at least basic, for Heidegger. The ground of all beings, and especially of man, is said to be sign. Sign would be translated, in the case of every writer other than Heidegger, by being. But for Heidegger, everything depends on the radical difference between being understood as verbal noun and being understood as participle. And in English, the verbal noun is undistinguishable from the past. I shall therefore use the German term after having translated them once into Greek, Latin, and French. Sein ist einer, esse, et seiendes is on, in, eton. Sein is not seiendes, but in every understanding of seiendes, we tacitly presuppose that we understand sein. One is tempted to say in Platonic language that science is on by participating in sein. But in that Platonic understanding, sein would be a scientist. What does Heidegger mean by this? One can begin, at least I can begin to understand it in the following manner. Sein cannot be explained by science. For instance, causality cannot be explained causally. We shall say, sein takes the place of the category surely in the Kantian sense. This change is necessary because the categories, the systems of categories, the absolute presupposition change from epoch to epoch. This change is not progress or rational. The change of the categories cannot be explained by or on the basis of one particular system of categories. Yet we could not speak of change if there were not something lasting in the change. That lasting, which is responsible for the most fundamental change, the most fundamental thought, is sein. Sein, as he put it, lives or sense in different epochs, a different understanding of sein, and therewith of everything. This is misleading insofar as it suggests that sein is inferred, only inferred. But of sein we know through experience of sein. That experience presupposes, however, a leap. That leap was not made by the earlier philosophers. And therefore, their thought is terrorized by oblivion of sein. They thought only of and about science. Yet they could not have thought of and about science except on the basis of some awareness of science. But they paid no attention to it. This failure was due not to any negligence on their part, but to science itself. The key to science is one particular manner of science, the sign of man. Man is project. Everyone is what, or rather who he is, by virtue of the exercise of his freedom, his choice of a determinate ideal of existence, his project, or his failure to do so. But man is finite. The range of his fundamental choices is limited by his situation, which he has not chosen. Man is a project which is thrown somewhere. The leap through which sein is experienced is primarily the awareness, acceptance of being thrown, of finiteness, the abandonment of every thought of a railing as support. Earlier philosophy, and especially Greek philosophy, was oblivious of sein, precisely because it was not based on that experience. Greek philosophy was guided by an idea of sein, according to which sein means to be to be at hand, to be present, and therefore, in the highest sense, to be always present, to be always. Accordingly, they and their successors understood the soul as substance, as a thing, and not as a self, which, if it is truly a self, if authentic, and not mere drifting or shallow, is based on the awareness, acceptance of the project as grown. No human life that is mere drifting or shallow is possible without a project, without an ideal of existence and dedication to it. Ideal of existence, this takes the place of respectable opinion of the good life. But opinion points to knowledge, whereas ideal of existence implies that in this respect there is no knowledge possible, but only what is much higher than knowledge. That's to say, knowledge of what is, project, decision. The ground of all beings, and especially of man, is sign. This ground of grounds is coeval with man, and therefore also not sempiternal or eternal. But if this is so, sign cannot be the complete ground of man. The emergence of man, in contradistinction to the essence of man, would require a ground different from sign. In other words, sign is not the ground of the fact. And it's not the that, and precisely the that, sign. If we try to understand anything radical, we come up against facticity, irreducible facticity. If we try to understand the threat of man, the fact that the human race is, by tracing it to its cause, to its conditions, we shall find that the whole effort is directed by a specific understanding of sign, of an understanding which is given or sent by sign. The conditions of man, in this view, are comparable to something in itself, of which one cannot say anything, and in particular not whether it contains anything sempiternal. Heidegger mentioned this reply. One cannot speak of anything being prior to man in time, for time is or happens only while man is. Authentic or primary time is and arises only in man. Cosmic time, the time measurable by chronometers, is secondary or derivative and can therefore not be appealed to or made use of in fundamental philosophical considerations. This argument reminds of the medieval argument, according to which the temporal finiteness of the world is compatible with God's eternity and unchangeability, because time being dependent on motion, there cannot have been time when there was no motion. But yet it seems that it is meaningful and even indispensable to speak of prior to the creation of the world, and in the case of Heidegger, prior to the emergence of man. It seems then that one cannot avoid the question as to what is responsible for the emergence of man and of science, of what brings them out of nothing. For ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes into being. This is apparently questioned by Heidegger. He says, ex nihilo omne ens qua ens fit. Out of nothing, every being as being comes out. This could remind one of the biblical doctrine of creation out of nothing. But Heidegger has no place for the creator God. His would suggest things come into being out of nothing and through nothing. Ex nihilo et a nihilo. This is, of course, not literally asserted nor literally denied by Heidegger. But must it not be considered in its literal meaning? Kant found, quote, nowhere even an attempt of a proof of ex nihilo nihil fit. His own proof establishes this principle as necessary, but only for rendering possible any possible experience, in contradistinction to what he calls the thing in itself. He gives a transcendental legitimation of ex nihilo nihil fit. The transcendental legitimation, in its turn, points to the primacy of practical reason in the same